Thank you to Noreen for having us here, and also being like I think of it as like that I get to be an opener for Francine, which is just an enormous honor for me. I was going to read from the story it's a short story collection. I was going to read from a story called American Innovations, which is the title story of the collection. Actually, one of my wonderful students asked me in a totally friendly way, why did you title it American Innovations? And I sort of had that blank look on my face, and he said, because I thought it was because, like Bob Dylan, he had this album, and he said, I just take the worst song on the album and use it as the title. That's not why I titled it American Innovations, but that's what I'm going to read from. This was in Singapore City, midday and in August. I was visiting my thin, tan, 60-something, non-native of Singapore aunt of exceptional math skills who had made her fortune from near enough to nothing in spandex and sequin fashions. When I was younger, we had called her Tina Turner because her styling was similar. Also, she had once seen Tina Turner in a grocery store in Los Angeles, and they had nodded knowingly at one another. That was the story. But now my aunt seemed smaller and tamer, if still disturbingly hot. Considerably more hot than either of her daughters, both now middle-aged and involved in their own relatively less demanding lives in more prosaic bodies in other countries. My aunt still shared her mahogany interior 7-bedroom house. It was a 60s construction with lots of obtuse angles so that you could make right after right after right after right and still not be facing your original direction. With her husband of all those years, although he left for the beach by 5 a.m. most days, and she was a night person, and so it was as if she lived alone. After 11 p.m., she liked to play bridge online, often with people, quote, in your sorts of time zones. My aunt told me that not everyone in the online bridge world was very nice. In fact, it was difficult to believe how rude some people could be. Really, it was amazing. This guy, she said, we were partners. He opened the heart, and then he rebid 2 spades over my no trump. That's reverse. Do you understand bidding? It's like he was going backward. Look, it's not common. To do that, you're essentially promising your partner that you have at least 16 high card points, at least. Are you following? For him to make that bid, he's saying he's got long hearts and a really good hand, and then he doesn't, not at all. We end up in 4 hearts and a 4-2 fit. It's like he's expecting me to have the hearts. It's totally crazy. Everyone else is in a normal 3 no trump. So I write to him, are you drunk or are you stupid? I said, are you drunk or are you stupid? Yes, she said, you can make chatter in the sidebar of the game. There's a space. I mean, you don't even play bridge, but even you can understand that he made a ridiculous bid, right? I've read 6 books on bridge, you can trust me. What he did was really idiotic. That's why I said what I said. Well, then he called me awful names. Just awful. I can't say the names. And he was the one who made the mistake. I almost didn't want to play bridge online ever again. And I have some very nice people that I play bridge with, but I almost gave up playing. See, that's what happens with the internet. Some people will be amazingly rude. I think I said something about how, yes, people could really be people. She said something about how I must be jet-lagged. I'm all right, I said. The main reason I was in Singapore was that a 1.5-year-long relationship of mine had recently come to an end, and it seemed natural to transition by visiting a friend who had moved to Hong Kong, and then, already so far, visiting my aunt too. I wasn't devastated, though. It wasn't that kind of breakup. My serial 18-month relationships consistently ended amicably. It was just a weird tick of mine, one with which I was fine. It was like I had been told I wasn't a woman. Did I ever tell you, my aunt asked, about my September 11th? No, she hadn't. It was late here, everyone was asleep. And my God, I was lying in bed. And then I noticed this lump, quite big, right here on my side. I was sure it was cancer. I was sure I was going to die. How could I have not noticed before? She went on to say, it was right here at these low ribs that aren't full ribs. Normally I would have called my friend Simona. She's an excellent doctor, you know, but I didn't think it was right ringing her late like that. That's nighttime thinking for you. I'm sure she wouldn't have minded. But I told myself I would have to make it on my own. until the beginning of the next business day. That's what I was thinking. I couldn't rest, of course. I went down and turned on the television, just to distract myself, to calm myself down. And what's there? The towers. Can you believe it? I mean, how awful. And they just kept replaying it. I sat there watching it all alone. Well, it wasn't cancer, the lump. It was just my breast. I mean, the silicone, the implants, it just fell down. Unbelievable, right? That they would put something in you that could do that. I said to the doctors, just take it out and never give it back to me. I like small breasts now. I used to hate them, but now I like them. That's awful, I said. I mean, about how scared you must have been. Then my teen asked me, are you still working on your physical therapy thing? That had been 2 career interests ago, but it was a thoughtful inquiry, considering that we didn't see each other very often. Oh, I said, no. When we set out to get a bite to eat, I was relieved. They have excellent salads at this place, my aunt said. She said, the best outfit is a good figure. I agreed.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Noreen, and thank you, Rivka. You should all just buy Rivka's book. I read it on the airplane I've been traveling a lot, and it was one long, alienated airplane trip, and it got me through. It just got me from one airport to the other. So I myself have always said I write for people on airplanes and in doctors' waiting rooms. So that was me. I'm going to read from Lovers at the Chameleon Club. Some of you may know the book began with a photograph by the great Hungarian-French photographer Prose, and it's a photo of 2 women sitting in a bar. One of the women is wearing a sparkly evening dress, the other woman's dressed in a tuxedo. A little research turned up the fact that the woman in the tuxedo her real name was Villette Morris. She was a professional French athlete, auto racer, discus thrower, javelin thrower. In 1935, the French government took away her license to compete professionally because she was a cross-dresser. Hitler found out about it and invited her to be a special guest at the Berlin Olympics. She went to the Olympics as Hitler's guest. By the time she got back to France, she was not only spying for the Germans, but she was the person who told them where the Maginot Line ended so they could invade France. She went to work for the Gestapo as a torturer during the German occupation of Paris, and she was assassinated by the French resistance in 1944. So that's the sort of real basis of the book. The book is written in a number of different voices, and everyone, except for one of the voices, everyone's writing something. They're writing memoirs, biographies, autobiographies, and letters. So I'm just going to read 2 little snippets from the beginning of the book. And this is a character named Gabor, who's based very loosely on Prose. Gabor is writing letters back to his family and his parents in Hungary, as did Prose. Paris, May 14th, 1924. Dear parents, last night I visited a club in Montparnasse where the men dress as women and the women as men. Papa would have loved it. And Mama's face would have crinkled in that special smile she has for Papa's passion for everything French. The place is called the Chameleon Club. It's a few steps down from the street. You need a password to get in. The password is, "Police, open up." The customers find it amusing. A bar, a stage, a dance floor, leather banquettes, tables around the edges, a typical Paris nightclub, except for the clientele. But here's the most surprising thing. The owner is Hungarian. She calls herself Yvonne. She's tall and blonde and dresses in red and has a weakness for sailors. She sings in that husky voice Papa adores, subdued and choked with tears. When she sang, I heard Papa's phonograph, muffled and locked in his study. Yvonne's song was about a woman whose sailor boyfriend has drowned at sea. I've never heard a sadder song, not even from the gypsies. Yvonne sang with her eyes closed, one hand raking her hair. In her other hand, pressed to her forehead, she held an unlit cigarette. I felt clammy and chilled to the bone, though the club was smoky and hot. I reached for my camera the way, as a boy, I used to reach for your hands, but I'd left it in my room. I was hoping to make a few friends before I asked to take pictures of bankers and diplomats whose wives might not know that their husbands go out dancing in high heels and dresses. Even after a year in Paris, it took some getting used to. The hardest part was not staring, or was I supposed to stare? Photographing these birds of paradise will be a challenge, don't you think? So Gabor goes up to Yvonne, the club owner, and asks to take pictures in the club. And she says no, because her clients don't come to the club to get their pictures taken. Discretion is very important. But because she's glad for a chance to speak Hungarian with anyone, she invites him back to her office at the back of the club. She pointed at a table on which there was a terrarium. Its glass walls were beaded with moisture. Inside, a miniature garden bloomed, complete with tiny topiary and classical Greek statues. Versailles, I said, what a coincidence. I photographed there last week. Yvonne said, are you blind? Mama, Papa, you know better than anyone what a visual person I am, how I learned my colors before any child in our town, how I could always find the potato bugs in Mama's garden, and was the first to spot Papa trudging home after a hard day of teaching. So you'll understand how embarrassed I was by how long it took me to see the green chameleon standing perfectly still behind a thimble-sized statue of Cupid shooting his bow and arrow. This is why I have fallen so madly in love with this city. Where else can one go to a cross-dressers nightclub and meet a Hungarian chanteuse who keeps a lizard in the style of Marie Antoinette? Yvonne scooped up the reptile and pressed it to her breast. The quivering chameleon gradually turned the scarlet of her dress. She said, look how little Louis matches my heart. Was this why Yvonne wore red? Was her club named after a lizard? I'd assumed it was a metaphor for her clients changing skins. Yvonne said, Louis is not my first. That was my Darius the prince, my lizard killed by a jealous sailor. For Darius, I created a tiny Persian garden. She sighed with what I hoped was grief for her departed pet, and not a patience with a fool she wouldn't be bothering with except for the chance to speak Hungarian. She said, one night I was working out front. My friend, a German admiral whose name you would know, let himself into my office and put my darling Darius on my paisley shawl. He died, exhausted by the strain of turning all those colors. I looked at the shawl that Yvonne was careful to keep from touching her pet. There are no German admirals whose names I would know. Forgive my ignorance. How often has Papa said that a smart man never loses sight of what the military is doing? Yvonne said, my customers don't come here to get their pictures taken. I understand completely, I said. Thank you and good night. Thanks.
I'm not going to ask you about how it's been going through your life with Prose as a pun, last name for a writer. I'm not going to ask that question, though it lies deep. But I was curious about, you come across an amazing story. You've written nonfiction books. You see the Versailles photo. You learn more about it. It couldn't be like a more full, ripe drama. And just figure out, make sure the microphone's working. Here we go. And so I am sort of curious about, there was a kind of moment when you decided to treat it in fiction rather than in nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And I was just kind of curious about that decision because you work in both forms.
Well, the main thing that happened was that my then French editor said, well, the French are so paranoid about the collaboration history, you're going to have to spend 2 years in the Bibliothèque Nationale making sure every fact is correct, and I thought,
no,
2 years. And also it was just so much more fun and interesting. I mean, it's one thing writing about the Berlin Olympics, it's something else writing about it from the point of view of a furious athlete whose life has come to nothing, and then she goes to Berlin and is suddenly treated like a celebrity. Those are two different stories, really, even though it's, you know, I mean, plenty has been written about the Berlin Olympics, but as far as I know, nothing's been written from the point of view of somebody like that.
Well, I mean, one of my very favorite scenes in that novel is a dinner party which has the thrill of cameo because Hitler is there. And part of what I love about that scene is that, I mean, we generally associate kind of bohemian life and even sort of the whole culture of being so peripheral with cross-dressing and transgender. And we think of that going left, and here we see this moment where no, it falls towards fascism, and it falls, and you know, and sort of the flattery of Hitler's attention is just a sort of powerful, charismatic man kind of sways it a different way. I mean, what was it like to write? I mean, that's sort of a terrifying scene as a writer, sympathetically, to write the scene with, for lack of a better term, the Hitler cameo.
It was so much fun. It was weird fun. And also it was sort of easy because, you know, Martin Bormann wrote this book called Hitler's Table Talk. And he wrote down everything that Hitler said at dinner for 4 years. I mean, you can't read it. It's shatteringly boring. You just can't. I mean, you know, the banality of evil doesn't come close to what this was. So he just went, oh, you know, it was vegetarianism and blah, blah. And then there'd be like a kind of shocking part where he'd say, I'm so worried because the circus has come to town and the aerialist performs without a net. You go, okay, this guy killed millions and millions of people. He's really sitting there worried about it. So I just lifted big chunks of his dialogue from the books and changed it slightly as I needed it and put it in. That was the easiest part. But also, you know, I mean, just factually, or maybe it wasn't factual, maybe I made it up, but regardless of how prejudiced Hitler was, you know, we know he killed, imprisoned and killed countless numbers of gay men, and he didn't seem to know that lesbians existed. But regardless of that, she, that is Villette Morris and my character Lou, knew people all over France because there was this network of sports clubs, because it was still so unusual for women to play sports that they had these regional sports associations. So she had all these contacts, and these women had husbands or lovers or friends. So she was in an ideal position to know if the women said, my husband has this new construction project, my husband, there's troops moving, there's military material being moved. So her utility outweighed whatever distaste Hitler had for who she was. It was Hitler and Heydrich actually figured she was much more useful regardless of whatever he felt about her.
And did you get a sense that he had a strong distaste for her? I mean, I just thought it was interesting that there's some sort of arcane rule that she wore something like 6 garments, male garments, and that's why that was why she was arrested. But how, when she comes to his attention, did you get the sense that it was a kind of political decision, this person is useful, or that it really maybe those were not his issues, so to speak?
I think there were his issues, and I think everyone else thought they were his issues, but utility was much more important even than that. And also he, you know, I read, well, over the years, I can't get enough Hitler. You know, you know, in what is it? It's in White Noise. You know, the great
Hitler Studies.
Hitler Studies. The guys teaching Hitler Studies. One of my sons said, "It's always Hitler Studies at our house, Mom." So, you know, he's endlessly fascinating. And I think for him, the joy of charming people, of being charismatic, was intense. So I think he even enjoyed charming these 2 strange female race car drivers.
Another question I have is, when you wrote the book, you decided not to go with the kind of, in terms of utility, very sort of useful third person, get to say whatever you want, reveal sort of the corners of everything kind of voice. Instead, you are sort of constantly shifting from one deformed funhouse mirror voice to another deformed funhouse mirror. Is sort of an odd choice of words considering the time period, the historical moment. But why did you decide to do that instead of the kind of, in a sense, like easier project of just telling it kind of from that sort of strange, removed third person where you can kind of shift?
Well, I was writing a historical novel, but I don't really like historical novels. I mean, I don't read them.
Were you annoyed that was your project?
I mean, it took me a while to realize that because it took place in the past, someone might think it was a historical novel. And I went, oh no, I'm writing a historical novel. So partly I had to find an end around that, but also I knew that I wanted to do the letters home. I knew that I wanted to do her, something about her, but I also began to realize that that each of the characters would only know a little bit of the story. So I kept needing more characters to kind of fill out the gaps in the story, which also could have been solved by an omniscient narrator, except, you know, I'm sure you've had this experience. These characters show up. They just show up, and they want their stories told, and you're pretty much in their service. You know, you're their bitch, basically. I mean, so I had no choice. I mean, I just felt as if I was listening to them when they were telling their stories, and I had to write it down.
How strong of a sense of Lou did you have before you put pen to paper? Or, because she is she's somewhat based on a historical figure. You had a lot of data about a real person's life that you might choose to use or not use. How formed was she before you actually started writing? Or did she come out like that, where she just started sort of pushing you around once you put pen to paper?
Well, I knew about 15 things about her life. There were real things. And then I had to figure out ways of connecting the dots. So that was sort of how the plot evolved. I mean, I just had to figure out why this would happen after that happened, you know, how one thing could evolve into the other thing. But you know, the sections about her, I kept trying to write in her voice, and it didn't work. I mean, I tried first person, I tried third person, I tried letters, I tried diary, and it just didn't work, it didn't work. And then I asked myself, well, okay, what do I have about her? And I had this completely bogus French biography from the 70s. I mean, you can watch the guy that wrote it. You can see him on YouTube. I mean, I used YouTube a lot when I was writing. You can see him on YouTube. He's like, get me a French biographer, a bad French biographer from Central County.
Is he smoking on the
YouTube video? Ask a little Pomeranian in his lap, you know, resistance expert. And he wrote this book, and you can't tell what's invented or what's true. No footnotes, no bibliography, no sources, no nothing. So she thought this, she felt this, she blah, blah, blah. You know, so I thought, okay, I can write my own bogus biography.
Well, and you feel that because you feel that there are sections where you feel like, oh, this chronicler has their own bizarre psychological need. And that's one of the things that I sort of think is so powerful about doing it that way, because those characters get to come out not by announcing their feelings and their sort of positions and their political sympathies, but by sort of lying in their own way or sort of deforming things in their own way.
Yeah, I mean, it also was very helpful to have the biographer. She was an intermediary for me. I mean, all my problems with the character, I could just put them off on her. So my problems with the character became her problems with the character. And also the fact that she can't shut up about herself and her own problems made it very easy, because in the end, as the story gets darker and darker in the last third of the book, she can't deal with it, so she starts talking about herself more. So it gave me a kind of way to leaven the darkness of the last part of the book, because her self-involvement is so weirdly funny that I could use that to just not have it be just darker and darker and darker.
Especially in light of the historical circumstances, right? Because I feel like self-involvement under the Clinton administration is like okay, you know, because everything's like problematic but not so awful, but it's sort of a different thing. Another thing I was curious about, though, is one of the things that I really admire about the book is it's really tempting to want to sort of completely understand why Lou behaves the way she does, because and it just doesn't line up perfectly with her biography. It's not like on one side you sort of have, this is my past, and this happened to me, and then I did this and this and this, and there's some sort of cheap kind of, how to win friends and influence people kind of understanding of human nature. But was that also difficult? I mean, because in what sense did you feel as you were writing the book that it was tempting to kind of, it's always tempting to have these kind of cheap pop psychology things just because then everything lines up.
I really wanted,
yeah.
it not to line up.
Yeah,
because
right.
I just don't, because it is cheap pop psychology. I mean, you know, it doesn't line up. I mean, it's all mysterious, and also because she winds up doing these things that are evil. I mean, it wasn't a, you know, they don't call it the mystery of evil for nothing. And I knew it wasn't, I wasn't going to solve it. I mean, what do I want to say? I mean, I've been very fortunate. The reviews, I feel very fortunate. I mean, you know, it can go either way. Okay? But the only ones that have sort of puzzled me are the ones that say, well, there's this problem, which is we don't get really to understand the main character. But that was kind of my point, that she's not understandable by normal means, that she's mysterious and she remains mysterious. So
there's a kind of lacquer at the heart of the self, and the end, there's nothing's going to stick to it.
So, do I get to ask you questions now?
You can ask me, but I'm dominating.
All right. So I had the strangest experience reading your book, which is I kept thinking that certain of the things I was reading about happened to me. That they were just, you know, that they were my own experience.
That's the secret story of the book. I'm sorry that your children like me so much. Tell me about it.
Yeah. And I wonder, I mean, for example, the story about the guy who works in the McDonald's, Ray, is that his name? The guy, I mean, it's about a young girl who falls madly in love with a guy who works behind the counter in the McDonald's. I just thought, I remember that, even though obviously I couldn't remember it. It was a different guy. So some of these, I mean, I realized a lot of it was invented. Some of these must have been sort of memory pieces. So how did you get back to that?
That piece in particular, I feel like, although I loved McDonald's as a child and did spend a lot of time there, I do think like almost everyone, not everyone I understand, but almost everyone has like a premonition of love before you have love. And so I do think like there's that childhood moment where you have a premonition of something that's going to dominate you and boss you around and make you do things and sort of tell you how to feel, and then it's sort of overwhelming and so I think maybe that's the universal part that falls out of the story. You know, it's funny, I was sort of thinking that one of the strange overlaps between these two particular books, although it manifests in such a different way, is that the characters are sort of, I hate all the terminology around this, but the characters are kind of sliding along a gender spectrum.
I felt the exact same thing. And I thought, oh, well, if I have to actually say something, that's the thing I'm going to say. Because even the part you read, when she says, I'm perfectly fine with my 1.5-year relationship, does that mean I'm a guy? You know, I mean, that what does it mean? Or the first story, when she's like, sort of okay with not feeling like a girl because of the way she's acting. It is about, I mean, a lot of them are about that, or sort of how you define that or how you don't define that. And what I like too, and I want to ask you about is, like, in your stories as well, there are all these questions that aren't cleared up, that aren't explained. I mean, the story about the two friends, when she, you know, kind of becomes involved with these two friends, and you never really find out what happens to the one friend who sort of disappears. How did you get over the temptation to explain it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing where I do feel like an affinity with your perspective, where I literally, you can almost like feel the sort of crossword puzzle falling into place letters, and it feels like such a lie that you just sort of think, oh, like this is on the one hand so organized, and it feels so profoundly dishonest that you're just like repelled by it. And so I always feel that way, and as I move along in a story, and like I remember, I have a story where a woman's furniture sort of walks out on her, it leaves her, and I mean, emotionally, I think it's sort of kind of basically like emotional realism. People will have these moments in their lives where they feel like their own life has left them. They don't feel like they're leaving their lives. For whatever psychological reason, they need to feel passive about it, or whatever it is. But I remember in that story, I felt tempted to sort of have some sort of traumatic event in her past that would kind of like lock everything into place. And I just thought, ooh, it's just, ooh, I can like feel the dishonesty. You can like taste it in your mouth. It's just, you know.
Well, that would have been the writing workshop suggestion, right? We need to know why this happened. We need to know what happened to her to make this happen, her feel this way.
Well, I remember a movie you could actually like, but that looks so silly these days, is the Manchurian Candidate. And there's like an amazing...
The old version or the new?
I haven't seen the new one, although I'm sure it would be an interesting compare. But the old one, and there's sort of a moment where literally, like, you know, they're so devoted to certain weird crystallized ideas of psychoanalysis that they want you to actually take it seriously, that they're going to whip out this card and the guy's going to sort of go into hypnosis. And I sort of think there's so much in the movie that's so smart, and then it's these weird moments where they're kind of committing to theory so fully that it's like you start laughing.
Yeah.
And so you always know, you're like, whenever I'm sort of fully lined up with sort of ideas about this, I must be wrong. And the only sort of intelligence, I think, for poetry or fiction, because basically all the other fields are smarter. They know more, they have more data. You just have to like be like, you know, I think the horticulturalists know more than fiction writers or whatever. But the fiction writers have some like ear to the ground, that's not true, instinct developed. And so I think that you have to stick with that, because that's the only like, I feel like that's the only overdeveloped intelligence we have over kind of data.
Yeah. Well, if we were psychotherapists, no one would ever go to us.
No.
Pay money to hear that there's no solution to the mystery of your lives, really? I mean, the other thing I thought you got so right, and I thought it must have been a challenge for you, even now, was to write about that time in a person's life when she, and usually in these cases, thinks that everything is going to be the way it is at the moment. You know, that is, you don't have any faith that it's, I mean, as you know, and it made me remember that, like how scary that was, where you just didn't have enough experience to know that things change. You just thought, this is it, this is my life, this is all it's ever going to be.
In fact, I feel like that's still like an emotional problem, because it's sort of, even just if you're like cold, you just think, I'm always going to be free. It's always, even in August, I'm going to be desperate for the fire. It's just a sort of para-literary question instead of a straight literary question, but sort of, I often like engage with the book as a reader, but then also as a sympathetic writer, and I remember, of all people, Philip Roth talking about writing The Human Stain, thinking, oh, this isn't going to go over very well, that I'm sort of occupying this territory of someone with a kind of covert African-American lineage. And I thought that about this book for you, that is there that stress that you're kind of entering a territory that is so hot and so politicized and so newly discussed in the mainstream media that it's sort of always been kind of somewhat deformed by that sort of fresh attention. Was that seductive or terrifying, or was that, or did you just not think about those things at all? You have your fiction head on, you're just like following the words.
I didn't think about it. I mean, but not for the best reasons necessarily. I mean, you know, there's this, you just assume, for better or worse, even though you've learned better, you just assume that you're going to be understood. You just assume that whatever you mean.
Where did you get that idea?
I don't know. It's like, it's so, that's what I mean. It's so naive. Now I still think that after having been misread so many times and so many, but somehow you just think, it's so clear to me, and my heart is so behind it, everyone is going to know exactly what I mean. And then it's always a shock. It's endlessly a shock when they don't. So it never occurred to me that anyone would think that, for example, that I thought that, well, just to take a surface example, that cross-dressing was decadent. I don't think it was decadent. I mean, I just don't think it's a decadent thing to do. When I was pregnant, I cross-dressed all the time because,
Why is that? It was clothes fit better?
No, because, I mean, back in prehistory, I mean, my older son is 35. The only maternity clothes you could get were these baby clothes. You know,
like little, a big muumuu dress.
Yeah, big muumuus with little sleeves and stuff. And I couldn't see myself suddenly becoming that person to wear this clothes. So the only alternative, I would get these like gigantic men's tuxedos and wear them. And
that sounds really hot.
It was
hot, to be honest.
It was hot. And it felt good to be a cross-dressing pregnant person. So I didn't think, I never imagined that it was a decadent thing to do. So I've been sort of surprised. But now, did you read this thing in the Times about trigger points?
I haven't read it.
You haven't, do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know what you're talking about.
I mean, some of you may know. You read it. Apparently now, like if you're going to teach a story in a class,
I did read this
you read
somewhere, maybe not in the Times.
It was terrifying.
You have to warn people on your syllabus.
You have to warn
this
people.
might upset you.
And it's like those little, I thought it's like those little, like the chili peppers on the Chinese restaurant menu. Like 2 chili peppers, 3 chili peppers, you know, the violence chili pepper, the rape chili pepper, the suicide chili pepper. And then I thought, there's nothing that anybody can read anymore. But if I had been thinking about that when I wrote this, I wouldn't have been able to write it. I wouldn't have been able to write it.
But did you think about a warning label on the book later?
No. But it really would have, speaking of deforming, it would have deformed the process because I would have heard exactly the voices that I didn't want to hear in my head, telling me how someone might be hurt or misunderstand it or misinterpret it, and you know, I would rather, however naive and however untouched by the lessons of experience, I would rather assume that I was going to be understood. I mean, don't you?
I haven't really thought about it, but I mean, I do. I think it's all, but I think I would think about it when I read other things and I'm filled with fear. But then the nice thing about writing, for me anyways, is that I often feel so passive, even though that's an illusion. I feel so not in control that I'm like relieved of any duty or burden or worry about anything.
Well, I remember when I was writing, I don't know, when I was writing mostly short stories, I guess, about young women, not so different from the women in some of your stories. And the books would come out, and I would get these reviews that would criticize me for not writing self-activated, empowered women, you know, and I was writing these dish rags, and didn't I know that women, you know, that myth was so destructive to women, even though it was my memory of what it was like to be at that age. So, you know, and I'm glad that I didn't know about that in advance, because it just would have ruined it for me.
No, because then you would be working in the genre of fantasy instead of the genre of literature.
Right,
Not that there's anything wrong with the genre of fantasy, but it's another...
Then I would have been writing The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. You know, superpower.
I didn't read it.
Well, you know,
she
has superpowers.
She looks good in the movie.
Yeah, she can do everything, you know, you know, physically strong, decode everything, technological, all the things I'm not. So.
I've often thought, like, it is interesting, I mean, to bring sort of, it's related to the kind of likability question that people talk about. It is that issue that sometimes with the book you sort of think, well, this isn't the life and times of Jesus Christ, an exemplary figure who we should all model ourselves after. And so I do think that's an interesting, weird way of reading that might even come from growing up reading the Bible, as if reading is about exemplary people.
Plenty of weird stuff goes on in the Bible.
That's true.
By time, you know, I mean, you know, unless you're going to survive a flood and have sex with your children, you know, it's like.
It's a good scene.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think every time you think about that, it can only be destructive. You know, what is someone going to think, or is everybody going to hate me, or, you know?
You mentioned sort of the one reason you chose to do it in fiction instead of do your project in fiction instead of nonfiction was your French publisher's description of locking you up in the Bibliothèque Nationale for 2 years. So what, I know you've answered this question 1,000 times, but I always think it's interesting. What was your research process, and was it something you go back and forth, or you're really just sort of relying on your sort of sense of human, so that even though it's in another time and another setting, you don't have to know, you don't have to spend 7 years kind of immersing yourself in the language, or how does that work?
Well, the human, I mean, the characters were always more important to me, and also
you probably know a lot about that time period.
Yeah, except my memory's so bad, you know. I just didn't want to make mistakes. I didn't want to make the kind of mistakes that would throw the reader out of the book. And
I want someone wearing a trilby for the wrong reason.
Yeah, exactly. and I hired this young woman who I kept referring to as the happy graduate student because there's so few of them.
Was she happy?
She's happy. She was French. She was writing her thesis about French science fiction of the 19th century. She's incredibly happy. She read through it, and she caught some mistakes, you know, that were, but she said, I know for thematically, you would like the Austerlitz Bridge to be in Paris, but I got bad news for you, it's in London. But, you know, I know that the other day, I got an email from some guy. There's a story, there's a Picasso cameo. Picasso tells this story about how he got these masks, because, you know, Picasso was a big collector of indigenous art, but how he got this mask. And he says, and it's this sort of long shaggy dog story about a guy who goes to Asia and lives with this tribe and so forth. Anyway, in my story, Picasso's story, he goes to Malaysia, and the email I just got said, well, this is a small thing, I loved your novel, blah, blah, but there was no Malaysia at the time, it was whatever it was. So obviously it threw him out of the novel enough to sit down and write me an email about it. So that was the kind of thing I was trying to do.
Although that might have been like the most pleasurable moment of the novel for him.
Right, got her, right. She thinks she knows something, but I got her. And then, you know, I read and read and read. I read things that were sort of unrelated. You know, I read a lot of history. I read a lot about the origins of fascism. And then I just went nuts on YouTube. I mean, it's like shocking how much you can see.
Because I'm actually scared of YouTube.
Be very afraid. Yeah. You can lose hours of your life that you never get back again. Well, there's a scene in the novel that's the last public guillotine execution in France. It's on YouTube. There's a film of it. I mean, do not watch this.
I'm surprised that they don't censor it, because they don't let everything on YouTube, right? But it's I guess there's no breasts.
There's no breasts, right? It's just someone trying to use. It's someone trying to use some equipment they've forgotten how to use. I mean, it's horrible. It's really horrible. And there's a reason why it was the last one. I mean, after this one, it was. You know, never good. But there it is. You can watch. I mean, again, don't do it. It's so horrible. It's up there. You can watch the French countryside from the point of view of a driver in 1928 going down the road with the you know the country streaming past him. So it's you know, dancers in a nightclub, singers in a nightclub. I mean, all the stuff that just directly went into the novel.
But then you make certain decisions to deviate from historical fact on purpose, right? So you aren't afraid to do, you're not sort of terrified of doing a sort of cameo of a historical figure, but your Henry Miller-like figure, you decided not to have be Henry Miller.
Right.
So what goes into that kind of thing?
Well, when it seemed like it was going to be constricting, you know, I thought, or when it seemed like it wasn't going to be fun. You know, I mean, it was, just to go back, it was fun to write that scene with Hitler. And I thought, you know, it was more like it could have happened. If it seemed to me that it couldn't have happened, then I wouldn't do it. But that dinner with Hitler could have happened. Or that scene with Picasso could have happened. You know.
Do you want to say something, Marie? Do we should do questions or Q&A?
Okay.
That's what we'll do.
Let's do that.
Let's do that. Let's take some questions.
Yeah.
Well, would you say I'm looking forward to reading about the Nazi period is alive and well, and everybody wants to read about it in fiction. I mean, is this now not disagreeable for people to read about?
Well, it's very disagreeable. But I can't get over it. I just can't get past it. It happened. Why? I mean, I was born in 1947, so it was, what, 2 years after the war. So I grew up in Brooklyn in an atmosphere in which it was very much in the air. It was and again, it's a mystery that hasn't been solved. So, is that me? Oh. You know, sorry, I don't know how to. I have a new phone. It's history call. I have a new phone that I don't know how to turn off. Okay, somebody ask Rivka a question.
I'll ask a question. I'm very interested in actually how you structured the stories, how you decide the order of the stories. It seems to me the order of the stories is very, very purposeful, and it's not a collection where one should skip around and read. I want to ask you.
You know, I thought about, the stories are quite different from one another in some sense, although in another sense you're sort of just stuck in the same room with the same kind of preoccupations, which I like. But I was thinking about the stories, putting them in order formally. Like in a weird way, I was thinking they're not in order they were written at all. And in a sort of cheap way, I wanted to put the stories with more conventional plot delivery first, as some sort of cheap trick to get people to read the rest of the book. But then it sort of was, there is a kind of unity to the characters, and I sort of have them going, not very strictly, but I realized later sort of further along a kind of spectrum that I find it hard to verbalize very well. But I remember reading a Murakami collection, and one of the opening story echoes a Murakami story. And the Murakami character is both irritatingly and wonderfully, there's always like a 30-something guy who's sort of being harassed by like a younger woman and an older woman. One of them wears a cute hat. Or, there's always like some, and he's really clueless, and he has a fantasy that he's very passive and not running things, and that these things are all happening to him. And then sort of things, you know, and then sort of the story moves as his sort of like broken sort of sense of reality beats up against actual reality, and it sort of like moves the arc of the story. And I remember noticing with one of his collections that in the opening story the guy was the most clueless, and then towards the end he sort of understood something about his particular variety of brokenness that everyone has, and it kind of made the stories move in a different pace. So mine also sort of do that a little bit, even though when I was putting them in order I was thinking a bit more formally, like, oh, this one has a kind of more resembles a certain kind of structure, and therefore it belongs at the beginning, and this one has a softer structure and it belongs at the end. But I then sort of thought it's kind of the continuum of the preoccupations that they have.
Yeah.
Do you feel when you write the main characters that you have to be sympathetic towards them, or do you want to be sympathetic towards them?
Well, I mean, it's very complicated when you're writing about Nazi torture to be sympathetic. I mean, I wanted to get to the point. I wanted myself to get to the point of thinking, okay, she does these things which are awful things, but she is a suffering human like the rest of us. And I wouldn't call that exactly sympathetic, but it's something else. It's sort of like sympathetic. And also, you know, anyone can make it's the likability question again. It's not that hard to make a completely likable character sympathetic, and anyone can do it. But part of the challenge for me of writing this book was to take this character who had done such awful things and make her a human being, like other human beings. So, would I want to hang out with her? No. Would I want her in my family? No. Was I fascinated by her? Yes. So that was really all I wanted.
Yeah. Going back to what you were saying, Rivka, about how you put the stories in order in a formal way, but then you discover that there was this like character spectrum, or some spectrum in how the characters thought or developed. Do you think that there's some relationship between your more like conventionally or more softly structured stories and the ways that characters are developing within them? Like, is that parallel revealing something about the stories, or was it just a coincidence?
I'm trying to think about that. I think, I mean, I sort of think of, some of the stories are quite realistic and some of them are less realistic. Like the story I read from the woman who wakes up and had, you know, unlike her aunt, there's no sort of explanation for why she has a third breast, and she sort of reacts to it or whatever. Which I guess technically, medically, like you could theoretically, but I try and make it clear that like that's not what it is. It's not just sort of like a, you know, a medical problem. But I think of them all as emotionally real situations. Like I think almost every woman and probably every man, I don't know, has like woken up one day and thought my body is deformed and I don't know what to do about it, but I'll just proceed anyways normally. And so I think that's kind of the continuum, and then the distance they have from that is maybe the way it lines up.
I guess I'm still curious about this likability question. It seems like if you're going to write about a character, or in this case, the dancer who gets involved with Hitler, or all these characters in your stories, or at least some of them. I haven't read all the stories in the book. Sometimes are not super likable either to the other characters in the stories or maybe to the reader, but really kind of raise a lot of questions about their reliability and what's really going on in the story. And so I wonder, when you're writing these stories, I guess this question is to both of you, but it was sparked kind of by the Lost Order story and the first story in the book. Do you think about, are these characters going to be interesting to readers? What is it about them? For me, it's this kind of honesty that they have, even if they're kind of what they're saying is being undermined by other characters, or things that are happening, or they're answering the phone and saying things that like aren't true, or not really accounting for themselves. So I wonder how you deal with this problem of making these characters interesting.
No, I think it's a sort of super live question, because on the one hand, from a kind of moral, almost like personal religion standpoint, I always think to myself, I actually do think this, that when we don't like someone, which is a common experience, which I have all the time, it's a failure. And so, in a sort of cheap way, I just remember ER docs, it's very common. They have to say to themselves, the more I hate you, the better I will take care of you. Because you know that you're more likely to miss something because you're desperate for this person to leave the room. So on some level, I always think, well, when I don't like someone, I'm failing, or whatever. And so that's like the human thing. And so therefore, you end up being drawn. It's more interesting on some level as a writer to write about characters that on some level repel you. Even though you could also say to yourself, why not pay attention to the good people doing good things? But you're not like a journalist, giving sort of attention. You're a fiction writer. It's a very different kind of attention. So that's the kind of almost moral thinking about it, I feel. But then but that's not what actually drives me when I'm writing. And so there, I almost feel like almost exclusively I'm interested in characters that are either somewhat boring or somewhat irritating or somewhat annoying, I guess because I like that energy of not getting along with something. I guess I sort of feel that that's somehow important, but I think it's also a big problem. I think that's why in Hollywood all the actors are good looking, so that no matter what they do, you're kind of just happy to look. and in literature, you have to solve that in a different way. And of course, it's terrible that Hollywood solves it that way, because there's surely a more interesting way to solve it.
Oh, well, I remember being in high school and having to write papers on, why is Satan in Paradise Lost more interesting than God? Or why is Iago more interesting than Desdemona? Or why is just about anybody in King Lear more interesting than Cordelia? So, so interesting isn't exactly the problem. I mean, the problem is the sympathy question. And then, I'm very I'm like the loosest teacher. I mean, when I teach, it's like basically you show up, you get an A. I mean, I just, you know, I shouldn't say
Good
this,
to
but-
know,
Good to know, yeah. But one thing that I tell my class, and I mean it, is if they use the word relatable, they'll fail for this semester. Because it's not a word, and because it's really destructive to literature, I think. You know, I can't relate to Raskolnikov because he axe murders two old women in the first thing. Well, that you're not meant to relate to Raskolnikov in that way. There's something else going on. So again, I think our obligation is to just show them. Well, you know, again, well, I said it over and over. But the Chekhov letter, where his friend says, "You've written about horse thieves, and you forget to mention that they're evil." And Chekhov says, "That's not my job. My job is to show you what kind of people they are. My job is not to deliver a sermon. My job is to write a story." So I think that is our job. It's not to sermonize or to say, these are evil and these are good and this is why, blah, blah. Our job is just to make it clear who these people are.
And this is sort of like kind of going too far, because I don't think this is particularly what you're talking about, but I remember my dear friend David Gordon, the writer who's here in the audience, telling me about an exhibition of kind of Nazi art, and one of the things that characterized it was like, it's like beautiful women holding babies happy. That somehow if like what you need to see in art is sort of not, there are beautiful women who hold babies who are very happy, that's true, but if for somehow it's essential that what you see is straightforwardly, there's something I think morally flawed in it. So of course it like becomes the burden of literature to be, if it's going to be good, to be somehow, to not give people exactly what they want.
Well, what's scary is when you're not allowed, for whatever reason, to see the other things, to see the not beautiful women being happy with the babies. Then you've got to ask yourself, well, what's that about? I mean, why is this being kept from me? And why is this, which is the scary thing about, again, the trigger points thing in PC and so forth. Like, what is it that we can't, why are we not being allowed to see characters who are evil? I mean, what's that about?
But as the author, don't you slant the reader's perception of the character by what you put in, what you don't put in about the character in the book?
Well, they're characters, you know? I mean, at the end of the day, I've made them up. So I can't, it's not like, you know, here's this person, and I'm only choosing to see a little bit of the person. You know, again, it's like some weird, they reveal certain things and they don't reveal other things, and you can only write what you know about them. And yes, it's slanted, but that's, you know, you're trying to get to, I don't know, the heart of who they are, really. And that, I mean, someone else might write about the character in a different way, except they're my characters. They're not the other person's characters.
I think we have time for one more question.
Or just drinks.
I just have one last question, if you don't mind. You didn't talk very much about Gabor and his, those incredible scenes of him as a photographer. It's such a great book also about the creative process and about his seeing, how he sees what's happening in the world. Could you just talk a little bit about
A lot, yeah, thanks, Noreen. I mean, a lot of the book is about art. It's about art. I mean, and it was sort of surprising to me that that's been the thing that people have noticed the least about the book. It is about art. He is a photographer, and he goes out in the world and sees it the way. And really the most helpful thing in writing the book, the thing that I depended on most and used most and thought about most, were Brassai's photographs. I mean, that was how I worked myself on my way back to what Paris looked like. That was how I found the characters in the first place. That was how, and he was a genius. I mean, he was a genius. He could go out into the night in Paris and just find these incredible visions of what the city was like. And, you know, he staged some of them too. That was part of what was interesting to me. So, so the whole question of vision and what you see and what you don't see and what you're looking for and what you find, all those things thank you, are central to the novel.
Thank you both so much.